Hello, and thanks for listening. I will be presenting my paper, Acoustical Panel Ceilings Origins, which covers some of my current research on acoustical panel ceilings, or APCs, a material I'm sure we're all quite familiar with. I'm interested in bringing disciplinary attention to mundane everyday materials that we often take for granted, like the APC. Because the ceiling system is so common in the United States, forming the backdrop for so much of our interior lives, it has enormous influence as a building material. My interest in the APC is not in arguing for a newer or better alternative ceiling system, but in placing the APC at the center of the story, synthesizing various theoretical, historical, and technical developments to return to the system's beginnings with fresh eyes. Before I get much further, I should note that I'm specifically using the term acoustical panel ceilings, which I will refer to throughout the talk as APCs, because this term is the typical nomenclature adopted in the master spec format, section 095113. In presenting the origins for the APC system we know so well today, I'll begin by looking at the broader category of suspended ceilings, which themselves only began to be developed in the 1930s. The APC developed as a specific type of suspended ceiling in the 1950s, and has been used extensively for the last 60 to 70 years. In particular, I'm focusing on the most common form of APC still being used today. The standard APC system is composed of both the 2x2 or 2x4 modular acoustical panels, typically made of either mineral fiber or fiberglass with a fissured surface, as well as the metal suspension system hung from the floor or roof structure above. Although architectural history and theory has not often mentioned the APC specifically, we can trace broader disciplinary influences to their manifestation in the APC. For Rayner and Banham, the suspended ceiling was a revolutionary invention, overlooked because of the discipline's preoccupation with exterior form. In Architecture of the Well-Tempered Environment, Banham provided historical context for the suspended ceiling, but primarily focused his discussion around his central thesis of the interaction between architecture and mechanical services. Siegfried Gideon's Mechanization Takes Command predated the development of APC, but provides an important reference point in the telling of an anonymous history of seeing humble things with unworn eyes. Banham saw Gideon's work as a beginning to his own work, while Rem Koolhaas's Elements of Architecture cited Gideon's, quote, focus on things easily underestimated in the everyday, end quote, as the motive for the entire exhibition at the 2014 Venice Biennale and the subsequent book project. Nevertheless, Elements tended to favor the novel and obscure over the quotidian. Reinhold Martin, in his exploration of corporate architecture in the organizational complex, connected back to Mechanization Takes Command as well, while focusing heavily on the curtain wall. In telling the APC story, I am continuing Gideon's work, building on Banham's observations, thickening Elements' exploration of the ceiling, and extending Martin's analysis of the organizational complex. It's well known that modernism was preoccupied with industrialization. Of the many sources I could cite, I would like to highlight two issues in particular of progressive architecture in 1957 that demonstrate the convergence of standardization with the high-rise office building. In the June issue, PA focuses on recent high-rise office buildings, presenting them as a standardized approach to addressing a particular set of constraints and objectives. Here you can see the case study projects presented as a series of stats like floor-to-floor heights and module width for window openings. The November issue focuses more broadly on the question of standardization and modularization, featuring a barrage of quotes from prominent construction product manufacturers as well as well-known modernist architects. Walter Gropius perhaps summed it up best by advocating for, quote, an infinite variety of interchangeable machine-made parts for building, end quote, that could be used to create unique buildings. The issue also presents modular measure, a system that was never fully implemented, but nevertheless played a role in dimensional standardization of building products. As Martin noted, the grid was the dominant image for standardization, and the aesthetic of the grid was implemented in hundreds of office buildings following the war. Returning to the ceiling, the grid supporting the ceiling became the dominant ordering device and Banham noted a dimensional inertia as the ceiling grid began to constrain the other products installed within the suspended ceiling. The APC also found its beginnings in modernism's interest in flexibility as an expression of functionalism. Mies van der Rohe was notably interested in a notion of universal space, an entirely open and presumably flexible space. Mies explored this typology through clear-span structure in the conceptual projects shown here, before achieving it in the construction of the Farnsworth House. From there, Mies increased in scale to create the single great room measuring 220 feet long by 120 feet wide in Crown Hall at IIT. The ceiling plane uses techniques of reduction and concealment to consolidate the delivery of building systems in a single abstract surface. Citing now well-worn contradictions within modernism, Banham highlights the inherent tension in the use of the suspended ceiling in service of an architectural style committed to an honest expression of a building's structure and services. In reflecting on the APC, it is significant to note that this tension finds material expression in the suspended ceiling. Of course, Mies was not the only modernist architect interested in openness as a symbolic of flexibility. The editors of PA somewhat disparagingly acknowledged the image of flexibility represented by the high-rise office building as, quote, slices of horizontality piled vertically, with distinction only in the conditioning of light, sound, and air, end quote. One could easily imagine office buildings of the time by Mies, SOM, and others as simply a composition of the great room of Crown Hall stacked on top of each other. Universal space united with best practices for office buildings at the time, in which a flexible open plan was preferred since the 1920s because future changes were considered inevitable. Martin noted an important shift in the concept of flexibility during this time, however, in that post-war office buildings were no longer based on the module of the enclosed office, but rather a smaller, more abstract grid. Further, the grid from the curtain wall was projected inward so that the standardization and integration of building components actually began to define the organization of the universal space inside. In recounting a history of the suspended ceiling, Banham notes the significant influence of air conditioning in its development. Dropped below the structure to conceal mechanical ductwork, the ceiling became, in Banham's words, quote, a multi-purpose membrane of concealed power, end quote. Notable was the triumph of air conditioning in the 1950s, when expectations for air conditioning shifted from a novel amenity to a near necessity. While taken for granted today, the ability for the suspended ceiling to modulate sound, light, and air in a single surface was a significant development that made the suspended ceiling an integral part of the glass slabs of the 50s. Although the suspended ceiling was being explored in other building typologies like schools, it was a particularly strong fit with corporate architecture. In a time of economic growth after World War II, corporations were building signature high-rises as a deliberate extension of their corporate image. In this crowded arena, architecture journals of the time noted that one opportunity to distinguish one design from another was the modulation of sound, light, and air. Of course, this modulation was accomplished through the suspended ceiling, suggesting that the ceiling was a key opportunity for innovation in high-rise office buildings of the time. The following case studies, the UN Secretariat Building, Lever House, and Inland Steel, were selected not because they were the first or perfect examples, but rather because they are important disciplinary reference points with respect to the suspended ceiling and issues of standardization, universal space, and integration of new technology. These three buildings were covered extensively in architectural journals of the time and are referenced in Banham's, Martin's, and Koolhaas's work as well. For my investigation, the area where the suspended ceiling meets the curtain wall is critical to the issues of standardization, universal space, and systems integration. This section is a negotiation between curtain wall, structure, ceiling heights, floor-to-floor heights, delivery of conditioned air, lighting, window treatments, and fireproofing in a complex set of relationships. Detailed study of the elevation, plan, and reflected ceiling plan of the case study projects reveal the architect's failure to achieve complete integration of these components. As such, the, quote, tension between the twin imperatives of flexibility and standardization, end quote, noted by Martin, is materialized in the break between the ceiling and the curtain wall, between the flexibility of a customizable, gridded ceiling plane and the standardization of the curtain wall that attempts to order the space behind it. While the Secretariat and Lever House both have their obvious shortcomings in this regard, SOM achieves a much higher level of integration at Inland Steel. In unifying the grid of the curtain wall with the ceiling grid, SOM elegantly accomplishes standardization, universal space, and the integration of technology. While these products did not include the standard APC, they are key examples of the evolution of this suspended ceiling as a device for addressing construction, theoretical, and technical issues. By the end of the 1950s, the conditions were set. In 1957, the Armstrong Cork Company introduced its Acoustical FireGuard panel product, which their corporate history identifies as the most important event in commercial ceilings history, selling millions of square feet within the first couple of years. In 1960, Acoustical FireGuard was used in a lay-in ceiling system that was UL rated to protect steel for 3 hours, eliminating the need for additional fire resistance treatment. Armstrong's ads touted the system as the first and only time design rated acoustical lay-in ceiling, and this innovation propelled Armstrong to overnight recognition as the industry leader. The advertisements suggest the product's intimate connection with the ambitions of modernism and its selection of Helmut Jacobi to provide renderings depicting the system's assembly, applications, maintenance, and detailing. Jacobi's role as renderer for modernist masters like Gropius, Mies, and Johnson was well known by the time, and his inclusion appears to lend significant disciplinary weight to the importance of the product. Through the Acoustical FireGuard system, Armstrong achieved another level of integration of technology in which the APC added fire resistance to the modulation of sound, light, and air. The product continued the standardization that had coalesced around the 2x2 and 2x4 modules, and its suspension system delivered a flatness that emphasized the abstraction and reduction desired of the ceiling plane. Maybe most importantly, however, the APC promised to do all of this cheaply, quickly, simply, and beautifully, while requiring little maintenance. It is perhaps this pragmatic utility that allowed the APC to develop into a thriving $1.5 billion industry more than 60 years later, long after architectural discourse discarded the tenets of modernism that birthed it. For me, this paper was about beginning to situate the APC within established disciplinary history and theory to demonstrate the way that our building materials develop in response to theoretical, historical, technical, and economic forces. My ongoing investigation into the APC will continue to consider its role in the built environment and as a significant cultural symbol. Thank you.